In this recording, we're going to talk about anticipatory activities. So anticipatory activities are activities that we do usually at the beginning of a lesson or at the start of a new instructional unit. And there are several different purposes for including anticipatory activities in the classroom. You might recall from the beginning of the semester, we talked about schema and we talked about how it's easier to learn new information when we already have prior knowledge that we can link our new information to, when we already have a schema about a topic that we're studying in school. So the purpose of an anticipatory activity is to help students activate what they already know about a topic that you're introducing in your class. Anticipatory activities are also useful for capturing students' attention, which is important because in order to learn, we need to be attending to new information. And it can also help raise students' interest in the topic, which is also important because when students are motivated to learn, they're much more likely to learn than if they're not motivated or not interested. So in the remainder of the video, I'm going to talk about some different techniques that you might utilize in order to include anticipatory activities in your lessons. So a demonstration is simply a performance that is designed to display a concept that you are about to teach. For example, if you are doing a unit on founding fathers or a unit about colonial America, you might come into class one day dressed up as George Washington or Benjamin Franklin, which would certainly be interesting because I imagine that you probably don't do that on a regular basis. So it would certainly capture your students' attention if you were dressed up like a founding father. If you are starting a new literature focus unit or you're doing or you're studying a new book in your class, what you might do is dress up like the protagonist or maybe even the antagonist from the book that you and your students are about to read. Again, that captures their attention and it gets them interested in reading the book, which is important because we want them to enjoy reading. Another thing that you might do could be a science experiment if you're teaching science. For example, when I was a teacher, I taught a unit on magnetism, and one demonstration I did was I took a pencil and I had these two circular magnets that had holes in the center, and I put the two magnets on the pencil, but I positioned them so that the similar poles were facing each other, and what happens when you do that is that the top magnet kind of levitates or bounces off the bottom magnet, so it kind of looks like it's floating over the bottom magnet, and that's really fascinating to the kids, and it's kind of cool even as a grown-up to see that happen. And certainly a demonstration like that made the kids really interested in learning about magnetism and why that happened. A visual display is another way that you can capture students' attention, and visual displays can involve technology, or you can go old school and use print materials. Examples include like a web quest in which students navigate the web in order to answer a series of questions about a topic that they are going to be studying. And one type of visual display that I really like is like a gallery walk in which you display photographs or artwork related to the topic that you're going to be teaching. And what students can do is try to piece together what all the photographs or pieces of art have in common, so they can try to figure out what it is they're going to be studying, and it also piques their interest. As an example, in our class, we're going to start reading Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Justice. So if I was teaching that book with a group of elementary or middle school students, I might create a gallery of photographs from the civil rights movement, especially from the Montgomery bus boycott. So I might display historical photographs like this. And I would have students try to figure out how all these photographs are related. For example, if we look at this photograph here, we see a segregated bus with African American people sitting in the back of the bus and white people sitting in the front of the bus. So this is a good demonstration of what segregation was like on public transportation. And I know it's probably hard to see, on YouTube, but you can see some small details here, like this board right here signifies the white section of the bus. So that's a big clue that this is a segregated bus. We also see here this photograph of this empty bus, and if you're familiar with what happened during the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1950s, you're aware that a large majority of African American people boycotted the buses and didn't ride, and they made up the majority of regular bus riders. So during that time, a lot of buses drove around Montgomery almost completely empty or entirely empty. In this photograph here, this is Rosa Parks after she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus. And I think that most students are quite familiar with Rosa Parks and might recognize her from this picture. But the idea here is to show students photographs like this and have them try to think about what they already know and have them think about how these photographs are connected to each other. Another strategy you can use to as an anticipatory activity is a thought-provoking question. And these are questions that are meant to get students thinking critically and capture their interest about a topic that you're introducing. As an example, if I was teaching Claudette Colvin in a unit on the civil rights movement, a question I might ask that's thought-provoking is, would you protest against an injustice even if it meant you could lose your job or be physically harmed? So you can have students put themselves for a minute in the shoes of the people who did boycott segregated busing in Montgomery in the 1950s. Not only did those folks go to tremendous lengths to not ride the buses and to walk to work and arrange carpools, but they also faced physical harm from people who disagreed with what they were doing, and they also faced the prospect of losing their jobs for what they were doing. So you can have students think, would you do that? Would you be willing to go to that length to fight against an injustice? Or let's say that you were teaching a unit on World War II. You might ask students, is it right to harm innocent people if it means ending a war and saving American lives? And that's a question that President Truman faced when he had to make the decision of dropping the atomic bomb, because as you recall, the bombs were dropped on Japanese civilians, not on Japanese military bases, so a lot of innocent people were killed, and it was thought that doing this would end, the war with Japan and save the lives of American soldiers who were fighting overseas. Is that justifiable? Is that right to hurt innocent people for that purpose? So you can have students think about that if you were teaching a unit on World War II. And this is probably the most common anticipatory activity that you see in classrooms. And I imagine a lot of you are already familiar with this, but I don't want to assume that, so I wanted to go over it quickly. But this is called a KWL chart, and KWL stands for what you already know about a topic, what you want to know about a topic, and what you learned. So one way that you can use a KWL chart is to have a whole class discussion, and you can introduce a topic. Let's say our topic is the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, to go along with our theme of Claudette Colvin, Toys Towards Justice. In this K column, what you do is you have students discuss what they already know about the topic of the civil rights movement. And as they name things that they already know about, for example, they might be familiar with Martin Luther King, they might know Rosa Parks, they might know about the bus boycott, as well as some other things like the March on Washington. You might list what they say here in this column, and that activates students' prior knowledge. It also introduces some content to students who are not familiar with the civil rights movement. Then what you have students do is think about what is it that they want to know, what do they want to learn as a result of participating in this particular unit of study on the civil rights movement. So in this column you have students generate questions that they have. And as you move through your instructional unit on the civil rights movement, you make attempts to have students answer these questions either through reading or independent investigations or class discussions. And what this does by having students guide their study of the civil rights movement or whatever other topic you're teaching is it helps keep them motivated, because these are their questions. They want to have their questions answered, so it motivates them to learn. And then finally, at the end of the lesson, or at the end of the instructional unit, you revisit the KWL chart, and in this column here, the L column, you make a list of what the students learned as a result of the unit on the civil rights movement or whatever topic that you're teaching. And what you also might want to do is revisit what you have here in the W column and have students consider whether or not they have any questions that are still unanswered. And if so, what further learning needs to take place in order to answer the questions here that you didn't answer as part of the unit. So it's just a really useful way for students to activate their prior knowledge and also reflect on what they learned as a result of the unit. So it's quite a simple activity, and it really can be used in any content area. It's very transferable, and I enjoyed using it when I was a teacher. So I just want to give a quick shout out to the sources that I use for both images as well as the sources for some of the information I included. So if you have any questions about anticipatory activities, please feel free to let me know.